Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this NLA webinar. And I'm Peter Murray, Curator-in-Chief at NLA, and I'm hoping it won't be long before we're able to do more of these events in person, but we've got a great lineup today to talk about a really interesting project. And just to let you know, we're opening our residency in King's Cross in Coal Drops Yards on Thursday. This is part of our plans during the COVID recovery phase, which we're planning to hold events right across London, activating different areas of the capital, using pop-ups and meanwhile spaces to do our bit to help get London moving again. But today's event is part of our Projects in Practice series. We have a Building Better program, which is also part of COVID recovery. And our aim here is to invite project teams to present the sort of technical, detailed aspects of their design, specification, and delivery. So our speakers today are from EPR Architects and Hain Tillett Steel, and they're going to be talking about 60 London Wall in the City of London, which has recently been transformed into a contemporary workplace, achieving BREEAM rating of outstanding. Before we start, as usual, I'd like to remind you that you will be able to ask questions at the end, so please do put them into the Q&A button as usual. So now I'd like to hand over to the team who will be delivering the presentation today. We have Jason Balls, main director at EPR, Miguel Bronze, who is an associate director at EPR, and Emma Croyle, an associate EPR, and they're joined by Mark Tillett, director of HTS, Andrew Howe, associate director HTS. So Jason, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Miguel, you'd like to start the presentation? Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Just want to take you through some of the early starting of 60 London Wall, and then we'll take you through some of the technical aspects of the project. So London Wall, situated right between Moorgate and Bank, in fact, and a stone's throw away from the eastern cluster, and completely opposite Finsbury Circus itself, which is a great aspect. Here to show as the sort of existing building, so right in the core of the city. Ourselves and Hain Tillett Steel are always very interested in the history of the site. Going back from the traditional timber housing that was on site, that then became the sort of shopkeepers and of London, to the creation of Little Bell Alley, which later transformed into Copthall Avenue, which is an important north-south connection through into London Wall, and indeed the creation of Finsbury Circus itself in 1812. So a fantastic piece of context. But really, where we started to really look at this building, it was as an existing building built in the late 80s, early 90s, built specifically for Scottish widows, known as 60 London Wall, which firstly made that sort of urban grain one piece of large office development. So the existing building was a little sort of postmodern, slightly tired, punched window, Portland facade, very complicated, heavy facade, and didn't let good natural daylight into the entrance. And even a building of sort of just over 200,000 square foot as was, had a very lackluster entrance, a very dark colonnade to the retail that existed along London Wall, and was really quite tired as a building. So it was a sort of challenge of how we kind of bring this building back into life and how we make it a new contemporary workplace. So our brief really from our client LaSalle Investments, together with City Grover's development managers, was to really reinvent this building as a new building, effectively. We know that the greenest building is the one that already exists. So from the start, it was about using that refurbishment of the existing structure, which led us to work very closely with Hayne Tillett Steel. Obviously increase the net floorable area, explore the floor plates as well. Here we had quite large floor plates and the opportunity to create very large floor plates from 40,000 to 20,000 square foot. So quite unique in the City of London. Relocate and rationalize the cores, which I'll come on to in a bit, and Emma will do a little bit more detail of that as well. Improve that natural light from that sort of postmodern punch window elevation. And we started at the very beginning of this, this is going back a few years as well, is really about that the wellness agenda was really coming to the fore. So the idea of usable terraces and amenity space, who'd have known how important that's become since sort of COVID-19. And really kind of reposition the building, create a better arrival experience and reconfigure the reception, even with secondary entrances as well. So the timeline, I think it's important to sort of mention the life of these kind of projects, start from quite a while back. So this project started in 2015 when we really started to analyse the existing building and started to talk to the City of London planners about what we might be able to achieve here on site. But it's interesting to mention, and I'm sure most people who are watching this webinar would appreciate the way that the City of London has changed considerably over that period, in fact. How the new occupiers in the city are demanding different types of space. So even during the journey of this building, the brief changed and adapted to embrace these terrace spaces that we started to create, and really start to embrace the exposed structure as well that Mark and Andy will talk about a bit more as well. Rather than sort of hide it up and gloss over it, celebrate it as a bit of the history of the building and bring it to life. So two sort of very initial diagrams, sort of analysis on the left-hand side, some of the things that I've talked about: poor retail frontage, poor entrance, also a very cluttered roofscape. And this is a building, especially here in the city, where actually the context is fairly low in comparison to the sort of eastern cluster. So this is a building that's looked down upon as well. So the sort of fifth elevation of the roofscape was very, very important. There was also a protected view from Richmond Park, a background view of St Paul's on the northwest corner that we had to respect. And it was really taking off that facade and getting back to a new optimized grid and creating a new entrance fitting for this building, and increasing the space and additional stories on top of the building, which was very important, how we could do that without reinforcing the foundations in a hugely manifold way, but really test the structure and make sure that we could achieve these spaces. And it allowed us to step these elevations back, creating 20,000 square foot actually of terrace space. So a little bit of sort of before and after, really, in terms of the comparison. So on the left-hand side, you can just about make out the sort of colonnade to the retail there in orange, which was very, very dark and gloomy. So the reprovision of that, bringing it out to the pavement line, and then setting the entrance back in this gentle splay, which creates a natural canopy to the entrance. And you can see the comparison between the entrance space, which was a sort of dog leg into the lifts, being much more of a kind of a gentle flow. And as we know, reception is being used much more now as a sort of meet and greet set down as well. Secondly, as well, Copthall Avenue, I talked about that north-south alleyway that connects through into Bank. And that was really seen as an important element to have a secondary entrance, which Emma will talk a bit more about as well. And here, I know something quite close to sort of Peter's heart as well. We didn't want to have the cyclists as a second-class citizen, so their access from Copthall Avenue at grade as well, entering into the changing rooms, which are very nicely fitted out, and then into the base of the atrium. On the next slide. We just really show the kind of reconfiguration of the cores. So many of these buildings that we start to sort of pick up, had 5 very disconnected cores, quite a sort of mean atrium in the center, and then that facade, very, very heavy. So what we did is we took that facade back a structural bay, and then reconfigured a more centralized core into really a southern core and a main central core with a brand new atrium with scenic lifts and passenger lifts. and upgrading obviously the washroom facilities, which we'll come on to in a bit more detail. And I think this slide really shows what we did structurally. I think Mark will mention a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. As Jason's mentioned, this is only a 30-year-old building, and it kind of felt irresponsible to completely drop the building, albeit many people wanted us to do that. Most of the contractors bidding for this wanted us to drop the building. It's only the age of most double glazed units. So, and this was 7 years ago nearly, and there was no retro first, and the keep what exists movement was a long way off, but it just felt like the right thing to do. As Jason mentioned, we had a very heavy, very compromised perimeter to the building, which we had to strip off. The cores just didn't work in their current arrangement. So what we were able to do was keep just about 50% of the existing structure, whilst we completely took the skin off the building in the first bay in and the central, so left with this donut of structure, built around a retained core, but we ended up doing a kind of very integrated temporary and permanent works, this kind of total engineering approach we support. Which minimized all of the temporary works going in. So later on, we'll talk about the embodied carbon, but we've measured everything, demolition, temporary works, and the proposed works. Thanks.
Yes, and from a planning point of view, what we wanted this building really much to sort of knit into the city. We worked very closely with the City of London to develop a plinth where we've brought out the retail and more of a pedestrian scale. The sort of principal accommodation, there's a very strong eaves line of sort of 5th and 6th story line along London Wall that really want to kind of make sure that we respected. And then you have the capital and the additional stories setting back from that and creating these terrace spaces. And some of those kind of early sketches were actually done with the City of London, but actually from verified views. So we did verified view photography very, very early on, so that we were very accurate about what we were portraying and how the building would look and knit into its context. And then I think this section kind of really shows the sort of ambition of what we were trying to do. We realigned the entrance directly opposite Finsbury Circus, and sort of effectively lifted the biophilia of Finsbury Circus up onto the building. Working with our landscape architects, churchmans, we got native species that are confident in Finsbury Circus and really lifted those up onto those terraces. And here through this section, you can see the kind of journey coming through that kind of new splay wall into a brand new atria, letting more light into the heart of the building, and you can see how that building steps back. And Mark, I think it's interesting about how we reuse the.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So the existing foundations are straight shaft board piles, 800 and 1200 diameter. And we did a lot of testing whilst the building was still occupied in its final few months, and were able to increase the load on those piles, reusing by 30%. So outside of the new core, there are no new foundations of the building. Although we added 50% more area and 4 stories onto the building, we carried that all on the existing piled foundations. So not just about reuse of piles, but really pumping up their capacity and sweating the substructure, which is kind of a fairly new approach to the reuse of buildings. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I think hopefully the technology works. Just got a little time lapse here, which sort of shows you some of that sequence and shows you some of that. Here actually is when it actually starts, is really stripping it back to the existing structure. And as the timeline starts to run through, we start to see the new structure that Mark was referring to coming on the outside of the building. So this is all the new structure on a 7.5 meter grid, so much more regular. And then you start to see the building take its form with these additional stories on the top. And as Mark says, all calculated that we weren't having to, reinforce fans or columns considerably. There's some technical elements through shear of the columns, but I'll let Mark talk about that. And you can just see the curtain walling going on now, which is a unitized curtain walling. We worked with Gartner Permasolisa, which Miguel will talk a bit more about in detail at the moment. Quite interesting to see it going up. There we are, in some sunshine. And I'll hand over to Miguel to talk a little bit more about the creation of that facade.
Thanks, Jason. Fortunately, the technology have worked and you could see the video. Good morning to all the audience. I hope you can hear me well. So I would like to briefly explain the building's exteriors and the fundamentals of the facade design. So as Jason mentioned earlier, the main facade design was developed to broadly respond to the street context and to its wider scape. It is a modern reinterpretation of a classic stone frame building with the advantage of allowing wider spans and large bays of fenestration. So the volume has a height of 6 stories, basically aligning with the volumetics of the existing building, but also with the streetscape of London Wall. It was broadly subdivided in a base or plinth with the ground retail units, the main entrance, and the first floor setback. It has a main body of the facade with the rhythmic projecting base with bronze anodized edge surrounds, large windows, and stone frame. The verticals create an element of brise soleil that increases as we go around the corner to Copthall Avenue, the side road facing west that has an increased solar exposure. The solid fins are important as a means of conveying solidity, especially when viewed obliquely, as we are seeing on this photo, while allows the maximum amount of full height glazing to the office perimeters that are most important due to the deep floor plates we've seen in the previous plans. This arrangement is completed with a bronze anodized capital or a crown, aligned with the volumetrics of the adjacent buildings that terminates the perceptive reading of the building we have along London Wall. This is differentiated with the use of a metallic finish that it's traditionally associated with mansard roofs. What most people do not see, unless you go further away from the building to neighbor streets, is the additional 5-story volume above the capital. These were fundamental to provide the much necessary additional office area that would allow for a business plan to rehabilitate the existing building and provide a space of excellency. The other particularity is that while the lower floors become an important foreground to London Wall, to the local street character and its relationship with Finsbury Circus, the top floors are on a cityscape spectrum. They are visible from afar, becoming the background of views from and other tall buildings. The way these were carved respond to the height of surrounding tall buildings along Bishopsgate, the Blackrock building and Angel Court behind, and the framework views to and from St. Paul's. For us, this different scale is important, the setting back of floors to create unique terrace gardens, promoting an inside and out use of the workspace where the views of the city to St. Paul's surpass the connection with the street below. These facades become backdrops of activity and planting at these levels. In terms of materiality, this dichotomy is exacerbated in the design. For the lower floors, it was important the strong solid frame, the rhythms, the variety of materials creating its own recognized character to the building. For the top floors, the background of city views, it was more important a lighter visual, with a strong connection between inside and outside spaces, but where the aspect of the volume could almost blend with the London skyline. Concerning the detailed design of the facade, we have managed to work with Permisleys UK from very early stages. That allowed us very soon to define a construction strategy for the facade, helping our detailed design and respective sequence in how the various elements were put together. The volume of the building, the repetition of basic elements and the limited space on site very early led us to progress with a unitized facade system. These define a 1500mm wide unit with variable height that could be utilized across the building with rare exceptions, and that could be used both to the lower floors and the top floors. Fundamentally, in a building with a variety of appearance, where the low-level street facade looks so different from the top, where there's a clear horizontal stratification and a vertical rhythm breaking the long facades, we are talking of over 2,000 basic modules that form the standard envelope of the building. It's the first layer of skin of the building. It was important for the program and logistics of the job, and to its quality too, that these elements could be built off-site in quantity and with quality control that only a factory fabrication could achieve. Once the main structure was in place and the fabrication was rolling, these could start being brought to site and immediately installed in place in a process that allowed us to enclose the building in a 5-month period. This means that what it looks like a stone frame building with large window panes was almost reverse engineered to a glass building where the various layers of solid frame, brise-soleil, and the projecting base were appended to the relatively basic glazed facade. This early connection with Premise Lisa allowed us a fundamental process of off-site mocking up of the various elements of the facade. These mock-ups were of extreme importance to test not only the required performance of the system, but also to delineate the detailing, the installation sequence, the strategy of fabrication and site assembly. You can see in some of the photos how we have built the entire base of site, providing an almost real-life section of the building where we can see the first layer of glazed curtain walling envelope, but also the bracketry passing through the spandrel zones from where the external layers of precast and recon stone elements with metallic brise-soleil were suspended from. Details on how the ground floor portals and respective doors were installed could be refined by these means, but also the top floor's glazed balustrades in respective relationship with the terrace. The final sign-off of glass panes configuration, the anodized coatings, and even testing of the external lighting were all done with the help of full-scale mock-ups. This strategy was possible due to the sheer volume of the building, the repetitive characteristics of the various elements, and managed to reduce substantially any site coordination issues, interface with the other building elements and other trades. In these photos, we can see the fabrication of the large horizontal precast elements, complemented by the vertical fins and testing of the assembly details. The resource to mock-ups was repeated to many other important elements of the building, from lifts to washrooms to walls and ceiling panels. We found, and for that we had full support of the main contractor, that it was much practical to review an off-site construction with time to test and change any elements that might not work, than trying to do it once the materials are on site and 10 stories are being built almost simultaneously. And I will now pass to Mark and Andrew to explain the bones of the building.
Thank you, Miguel. As Jason said, one of the things we discovered early on were these statement pieces, these 15-meter, very efficient lattice trusses, and we really wanted to embrace that with the design. So you can see an early CGI here, where the 15 by 7.5 meter grid. So maybe a slightly unusual grid now. We've obviously mentioned we opened up the facade to get onto that grid, but then really embracing these and some of the things to think around the fire and how we shot blast those. They're very thin elements, but also you can see a cellular beam to the right. So both new floors on that 15 meter working with the grid, but also on bits of the existing with the donut structure that Mark mentioned as we demolished. How do we pull all of these together in a sort of very efficient new design? Do you want to go to the next slide? So we retained 49% of the existing structure, and then this sort of donut ring around it. But ultimately, we're adding 4 additional floors plus a very substantial plant deck as well on the top. So in order to do that, a lot of additional load back through the existing frame. We wanted to expose it, but we also really worked hard to sweat the structure. We did steel testing. We had to provide a full warranty for the structure. So we were surveying connections, bolts, looking at splices. And ultimately, we were able to justify only strengthening 10% of the existing columns, and then using plates to carefully also detail so that we could keep the shape of the columns. It's normally very efficient to turn a column into a box section, but that would have just very much this idea of an exposed structure would have really damaged that. So worked hard to actually change that, strengthen onto the flanges and keep this sort of expression of those columns through the building. Next slide. A key part for us to sort of unlock this potential is what we would say is our total engineering approach. So we did both looked at very closely at the demolition, but also the permanent works. We also look at the temporary works, and this is a common approach on projects and something that was very important here. And you can see this early sequencing work and looking at phasing that we did prior to any contractors being on board, but then allowed us to have some very productive conversations as different contractors. There were 3 different contracts through this job, from strip out through an enabling works with demo package that then became the sort of main works package. So being able to straddle that, being able to have constructive conversations, but also to carefully think through how logistics might work around site, how we might try and keep as much of the structure as you could, and how we might also utilize elements of the retained structure to form parts of our temporary works to, again, limit the amount of, in a sort of carbon side, the amount of additional steelwork we've got to bring in. On the next slide. So you can see some of the images here of different elements of the retained structure. On the bottom left there, the party wall, where we utilised, where we could, parts of the columns and beams with a few additional elements just to provide temporary restraint to that wall before the new core came up. And then on the right there, one of the other key details, you can see the trusses, is just thinking through the interface between the existing metal deck and the new. You've got efficient composite beams, but actually just did a lot of work just to think through how can we get that detail. And as you can imagine, nothing is perfectly horizontal. Doing a lot of work with EPR just to think about how we're going to get these interfaces well exposed. And we ended up with a sort of shelf angle, a Z bracket detail, and just very clearly expressing that interface. And if you jump to the next slide. And here it shows, this is right at the end of demolition, just before the steel erection took place. The donut structure, you can see very clearly that Mark mentioned, and just thinking through with the braces and the steel, and we've modeled the whole lot. So everything is part of that carbon story and just thinking through what we were doing. Next slide. And then in terms of, Miguel mentioned the heavy precast elements and other bits. So for us as well, that just thinking through, connections onto the steelwork, both the sort of exposed steelwork, what the members would be and what they would look like, but also thinking through some of the brackets, and some of these were also installed in the factory by Severfield. And so carefully just working out how this is going to go together and how it's going to fit, and consideration, because ultimately it was all going to be exposed. And then to the next slide. And so what you can see here is just getting back to this much more efficient 7.5 grid. But as we start to get to the terraces, one of the key there is this sort of cascading effect as you've got various transfers. And so again, for us, very carefully thinking through, trying to keep it efficient, working with existing beams, in some places having to strengthen those, but to deal with terraces and potential changes in loads as you go through, but ultimately trying to open up, and you can see the landscape, the streetscape behind, making sure that, from any part of this building that from what was a very heavy postmodern facade, we've opened that up and expressed that. Back to you, Miguel.
Thank you, Andrew. I'd just like to quickly talk about a couple of challenges where we had to use some creativity to resolve areas within the building with special constraints, and where a good relationship with the structural engineer really helped. So the existing building had a section of the facade along Copthall Avenue and bordering the adjacent building just south of ours. So it has a section of the facade that was retained during the previous rehabilitation of the building. The previous intervention was not particularly successful, so the level of the floor plates wouldn't match the level of the windows and would partially or completely block them. As we were using the existing slabs in the lower floors of the building, the relation between windows and structure was not changing unless we would talk to HES and could do something about it. So during the strip out, we've worked to uncover those windows and through a modeling exercise to virtually deconstruct it, deconstruct the facade, bring it to its basic elements. We then proceeded to work with the structural engineers on ways to carve the slab perimeter that would allow us to reuse these windows and bring the much necessary natural light to the floor plates. In the process, the mansard roof that was in really bad state was rebuilt with 2 new piers of Portland stone framing it. So these images show the result of that reintegration of the windows to the floor plates and the enhanced transition between new facade and retained elements. The second case, it's on the east of the building and along the main party wall with, or the longest party wall with the adjacent building, where once more we had to use some ingenuity. That this area was what was historically a group of badly illuminated wells facing a very patchy party wall. We needed to provide ventilation shafts that would serve the basement plant and also double as smoke extracts in the fire situation. In what traditionally would be a confined space with large ductwork coming through the side of the building, we have looked to how to use this void to serve the floor plates and create a quality space. So by further opening the slabs and moving some of structural elements and having the mechanical engineers working on the CFD model to optimize the air volumes, we have designed 4 glass compartments that would segregate areas of air intake and extract. These shafts effectively work as light wells, bringing much needed natural light all the way down to first floor. So as you can see on the left-hand side, as part of the design, we have cladded the party wall, mocking an active facade as part of the adjacent building. The funny fact is that most visitors looking to this area usually ask us if what is visible across the light well are corridors inside the neighbor building, and if you can actually see people passing behind the screen. So I think it must be incidentally the first active party wall by suggestion in the city instead of being actually active. So in conclusion, what was in fact a very glum space with little potential, it has become an interesting and attractive area of the building with abundant light without losing its original functionality as the ventilation shaft. So now I'll leave it to my colleague Emma to take us in a journey to the building interior.
Thanks, Miguel. So I just want to talk a bit about the decisions that we made that sort of led to future flexibility and the adaptability of the building. We'd worked, as we've said, we've worked very hard to reuse what was there. And so we wanted what we were putting back to be able to be reused and adapted as the requirements for the building and its occupiers changed over the building's lifespan. So I just wanted to take us through the internal arrangements. As Jason already mentioned, a key thing for this building was to improve the office entrance experience. So we've opened up the reception. It still relates directly to Finsbury Circus, but it's a lot more open with double height space. And we've also increased the retail units to come right out to the back of the pavement line, so reducing that dark colonnade that was there as existing. Sort of key points to make about the reception in terms of adaptability is that where we've got that sort of green square, that's a soft spot for future escalators which could be put in. There'd be sort of additional security barriers to be added, but that would be a relatively straightforward thing to do. Another kind of challenge with this space was that we've got the UKPN access hatch, which had to be put actually in the reception area. So you can see that in the orange square there. And part of the facade actually needs to open up to allow for the transformers to come in through there. So it's quite a challenging space, but I think we've managed to kind of make it feel seamless. This then sort of, you go through the security barriers and through the tunnel to get to the atrium space. This is a 10-storey atrium, so it goes right from the roof. It's really key to allow for additional natural light and daylighting into the office spaces. It is quite a deep plan building, as you can see from the typical floor plans. This also houses all of our passenger lifts and our scenic lifts. We've set them kind of, you can see that they're a little bit offset. This does a couple of things. So it helps the flow of space to go from reception into that atrium. You can see we're kind of pulling back the scenic lifts there. It also allows for the space to be used more efficiently between the lifts. So because the doors are offset, people can gather sort of in a staggered way rather than opposing each other. We've also, sorry Miguel, we've also allowed for space for an additional lift, a soft spot and a formed lift pit that will allow for an additional scenic lift should that ever be required in the future. Just to talk a little bit about the interiors, I think it's fair to say this brief really developed over the life of the project and responds in particular to the changing demographics of people that are using the cities and the companies that have decided to locate in the city. So potentially originally at the start of the project, we were looking at financial and kind of law firms. This has really expanded over the last few years to be more like tech and fintech, but even designers and architects as well. And also the full sort of range of generations and age groups that would be using this building. So that's something that we really wanted to bear in mind. And it was something that we worked with the interior designer March and White on the reception and atrium areas to start to really give a character to these spaces that had a real hospitality feel. So rather than a stark office space, we wanted to introduce warm finishes in this timber paneling, high quality finishes with feature lighting, and also FF&E throughout the spaces to make them usable and to make them an attractive place for people to actually want to come now after COVID back to the office as well. And then in the atrium, we've got these alcove spaces again that have been dressed in kind of a similar way that you would get in a hotel to create this feeling of luxury, this inviting kind of warm space that you'd be able to come and meet people from potentially the different tenancies in the building. And this design is also, EPR kind of ran with this through the rest of the building and through the other spaces, which I'll go through. So in particular on the scenic lifts in the atrium space, we introduced this kind of pop of red colour to try to give that fun and to give us a bit of character and some life and interest to the interiors there. So another key part in terms of flexibility is our flexible common space just at the rear of the building. This could be used for tenant spaces. They would have their own dedicated entrance at Copthall Avenue, or it's been designed to potentially open up into the atrium and reception space. At the minute it's a shell and floor finish, but it could be used for kind of cafe and touchdown space, which can relate to that retail unit to the left there. And it can also be it could also be flexible enough to maybe become an event space. Go on to the next one. Which could be, I mean, it could be open to the public, or it could just be used as an amenity for the rest of the building, really. So that was something that we thought was quite a key part of what could be offered there. So as Jason already touched on, cycle cycle spaces and cycle amenity for this building was really key, particularly now I think more and more people will be cycling. So we've given a generous ground floor entrance, which is nicely designed. No one's going into the back room of anywhere. With generous cycle storage, and you can see there are our shower rooms, shower changing and sort of towel and locker spaces as well. If you go to the next one, the sort of interiors have been designed again with this hospitality feel. So really high quality finishes. They're quite simple and well put together. They relate back to the washroom spaces, which we'll go into. But it's just carrying on the kind of the warmth, hospitality, and picking up some of the industrial elements like our concrete vanity units and things that you've seen in reception. We also, EPR ourselves, designed the signage for the scheme. So you can see that's the cycle route in there with the yellow wall. And we've also designed kind of flag signage with icons throughout for the various elements. So it's just to add into that kind of refined and consistent character that we've tried to create in the building. So to move on to the typical floors, our core is a cruciform shape, which is arranged around the atrium. This gives our 4 entrances into the core, allows for future subdivision of the office spaces themselves. We've also got the two stairs, so we've got goods lift at the top left and then our firefighting core at the bottom right, and then the WCs there, which have been arranged. So on the female WCs, we've got a dry lining wall, which allows for future expansion of those WCs. And with the male WC, we worked with HTS to give us soft spots in those core walls to again allow for those WCs to be expanded if that's required in future. So a little bit about the lifts at typical floor. We've got our scenic lifts there on the left and then passengers on the right. We've got these quite long corridors as a result of our cruciform shape. So what we were doing at the passenger lift is creating quite a subtle, maybe you can see it on there, subtle sawtooth. It's kind of creating little alcoves to allow you to get into the passenger lift. So you can see a detail on the right there. We've continued the sort of warm timber paneling, but also given some highlights in some laminated glass panels, the brightest of which are between each of the passenger lifts. And then on the general corridor space, we've randomized the paneling to help to break up these long corridors and also added these highlights in a more subtle laminated glass. The doors there are flush doors into the WCs just to create that kind of high quality seamless look. And we've got our little flag signs with those icons to bring you into the washrooms. Hopefully we'll get to, there we go. So the washroom design was really, I think, a key part of the experience of the building. It was again another mock-up, a full-size mock-up of a male washroom. So that included WC cubicles, urinals, our vanity unit and mirrors that we can see there, and an accessible WC. This was incredibly useful to kind of work through the various details. We've got a few different materials and finishes going on here, and I think the detailing between them was really key. We were able to work closely with the subcontractor to refine those details through the mock-ups. It was also helpful to have a one-to-one mock-up for making some sort of client decisions early doors. We were able to kind of swap out things like sinks and taps, so we could make sure that we had something that the client was really getting behind and really happy with. Sorry, I've just got one more thing to say on that one. The key, I think something that really elevates this scheme is having the bespoke element. So the mirrors were designed by us and made by a company called Mobile Fresno, who were incredibly helpful. And we wanted to have kind of one mirror for each basin, again adding to that hospitality feel. And the paper towel holders there were also bespoke by us. Just to touch on the actual workspaces, the majority of the building is shell and floor, but we fitted out 2 floors to Cat A during the base build. So the 8th floor is a standard plank ceiling with exposed columns. There's so much hard work's gone into them. And the 4th floor is a hybrid Cat A ceiling, which you can see here. So around the perimeter, we've got ceiling rafts and a bulkhead, which gives us a bit of consistency as you look from the street level. So every floor would have something like that. And that also allows for future subdivision into cellular offices or meeting rooms around the perimeter there. In terms of design, we, on all of these floors, we wanted the steelwork to contrast with the surrounding finishes to really emphasize and make the most of it. So we've got this dark grey steelwork with a very light grey soffit. Services design was designed to be quite a consistent colour throughout, and then you get this datum of lighting. And we've tried to break up the floor spaces in this design with linear lighting on the more sort of standard grid. And then when we've got these nice 15-metre spans, we've changed to these uplit circular lights as well, that just breaks up that floor space. So post-contract, we were also asked to fit out another 2 levels to a Cat A finish. So we've done that consistent perimeter as well on these floors. We've even shown we've got a bit of plank ceiling in the, as I say, the more kind of standard ceiling, standard structural grid areas. And then in the areas where we've got these 15-metre spans, we've added perforated ceiling rafts, as you can see at the kind of right-hand side in the distance there, which are lit to really start to punctuate the space. These are deep floor plates, so it just starts to break them up and also add interest and brighten the sort of deeper parts of the plan. So just to talk quickly about some future flexibility, we've again worked closely with HTS to find the best locations for soft spots, so that any tenants can break between their different floors. This was a visual that we did just to show what a feature staircase could look like. Go to the next. And then just to emphasize that the majority of the floor spaces were originally fitted out to shell and floor. So again, you can see some of the nice steel work there, but it just eliminates waste as much as we can. So we're not putting in ceilings that will eventually be ripped out, and it allows a tenant from the sort of varying sectors to be able to fit out their floors how they would want to. So whether it's exposed or whether it's a more traditional Cat A ceiling, it's completely up to them. Just to talk quickly about the terraces, we've touched on them a lot, but just to say they have been designed to be usable spaces. We created these, the planters and benches along with churchmen's, the landscape architects. They all have power and data in them, so you're able to kind of plug in your laptop or your phone and work out there on nice days. The planting, again, this from Finsbury Circus, but is like proper planting to give that sort of feeling of well-being that I think we've all started to recognise, that a bit of nature is the right, can be very kind of helpful. And it's a really unique sort of space to have in the centre of London, I think. And just to speak a little bit about the lighting here, is another mock-up that we did. We worked quite closely with the planners to make sure that we weren't creating too much light pollution in this area, but we still wanted to light the terraces nicely so that they could be used kind of throughout the the day and throughout the seasons. Handing back over to Andrew and Mark.
Thanks, Emma. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the kind of sustainability statistics of the building. So the total embodied carbon, top left-hand figure there, that's what we added to the building. So that's all the new steel, the new concrete in the trays, the new piles we had to do under the cores, the new concrete cores, but also we've allowed in there for all the demolition, the carbon associated with that, and all the temporary works. With that new carbon taken over the GIA, the figure to look at is that 193. So that's where the project ended up in terms of a structural perspective at practical completion. And it sits just outside the REBA 2030 target and well within the LETI 2030 target, which is quite a big achievement considering, as I say, this was designed 7 years ago. And the grid that we inherited, which we took through, is largely a 15 metre by 7.5 metre grid. So it's a big 90s grid. And as anyone who's done this before knows, it's not easy to be sustainable on very large grids. The steel tonnage you have to add is huge as the spans increase. Much more so nowadays, especially with the drive for more sustainable structures. 7.5 by 9 is much more the norm, and these huge mega grids of before are not so commonplace. You can see top right there where all of where we spent the new carbon, mainly in the floors and the walls. Obviously, we reuse most of the foundations, and most of the existing columns we're able to actually replace. Can you, reuse existing columns? Next slide, thank you very much. So 49% of the existing structure was retained. Top right, we had to demolish 51%. The graphic on the bottom right there, that represents the area of native forest we were able to save. That's a 27-year growing cycle for a native woodland, and all the carbon dioxide that was sequestered over that life. And by keeping 49% of the existing structure, that's what we were able to save on site. Next slide, please. So yeah, design for adaptability. I think, you know, people design buildings for 60 years typically, which is completely the wrong approach. I think we need to look at a 180-year view, you know, which would take us back to 1840. But a lot of the buildings we work on and the block sites include buildings of that age, and we should be looking really at not practical completion, but kind of a lifetime achievement award for buildings. And over that life, you know, the building will have many uses looking forward, and it's had one massive evolution. But I think, you know, we need to think, well, this building can have many more evolutions going forward, and it might become residential, it may become hotel, it may become life science, and how the structure which we've created, which is a very flexible structure, may respond to those demands. And we're not saying that it can achieve all of these. Life science is very difficult to achieve in terms of floor footfall and vibration. You know, we factor in and we model now how you could adapt it to achieve these usages, and maybe with the installation of localized columns. So you're not building in full adaptability day one, but you factor it into your considerations so that the asset you're creating has so much inbuilt value for flexibility, which we think will be measured and penalized going forward if buildings don't perform and you need to spend carbon to achieve these new uses. I think just generally, you know, we added 50% area, we retained 50% of the existing structure. The steel tonnage, we achieved a steel tonnage over the whole thing of 45 kilos per metre square, which is very low considering those grids. And I think a key thing Andrew touched on is that we had to warrant all of the new structure. So this is very much a new approach for refurbishment, whereby normally it's sold as seen, but here we warranted every bolt, every connection of everything that was retained, did full investigations on it, which is kind of unheard of. So we had all the benefits of retention with the carbon, but it's effectively a new build in terms of the warranty and the paperwork which it comes with. And I think that's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. As we all know, that projects like this is a big team effort as well. So from Citygrove as development manager, LaSalle as client, Mexerv with the MEP, as Miguel explained, conceptually complex, Churchman's Landscape, March and White Reception, interior design, Studio Fractal Lighting, Exigia on cost consultancy, and Skanska, who built it, and many others who have all contributed to transform what was a bit of a tired postmodern building and reinvent it into a contemporary piece of contextual architecture that we think knits well into the city, and to create these new flexible workplaces and new retail fit hopefully for the next generation who are going to call the city their home. So thank you very much for listening, and we'd love to take some questions.
Thank you very much, everyone, for those presentations. And so if you're in the audience and you'd like to put a question, please do put it into the Q&A panel on your screen. But I've got a couple of questions I'd like to ask, and I mean, this is for Andrew or Mark, really. And Andrew talked about 10% reinforcement of columns. And I was going around the Hopkins retrofit of 100 Liverpool Street, which was, I think, probably designed about 10 years earlier than the building we're looking at today. And there was so much redundancy in the structure that actually they hardly had to strengthen anything. Presumably, then, there is a gradual improvement in the efficiency of structures as probably computerization becomes more and more common within engineering. So can you look at buildings of particular periods and suggest when that sort of redundancy is maximum and when it starts to become more efficient? So when you upgrade the buildings, you actually don't have really that much to spare to play with, and you have to reinforce if you're going to add additional structure.
Yeah, Peter, I think it's an interesting point. I think building adaptability in the right place, or spare capacity in the right place into buildings, is still a good thing to do. Where it's been kind of recklessly done in the past is institutional type floor loading. So 5 kilonewtons in a meter square, 500 kilos, you know, it's half a ton a square meter for a normal 80s, 90s office building. So what we kind of promote going forward is floor slabs, which has a huge volume of structure and carbon. Design those to sensible loads, less than BCO in many cases, down to 2.5. But actually, columns and foundations, where you can buy a lot of future adaptability for a very low carbon cost. Actually, there's an argument to keep those with some spare slack, so that as planners relax over the decades and the height of the city is allowed to kind of incrementally increase, you can add floors onto buildings with little impact. But where you really want to save the carbon is on your slabs, which won't affect future adaptability. So we kind of promote keeping that spare fat in columns and piles, because it has a very low carbon impact. It's all about volume of material.
Yeah, very good, thank you. Perhaps I could ask Jason, in the I mean, in the early planning, how high could you actually go? Because I'd heard that there was some conversation of the Deutsche Bank building next door, further along London Wall, that might actually be absorbed into the city cluster, and the city planners might have a slightly more relaxed view of height. How constrained were you? Because obviously you were pushing at the limits, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think, yes, at the time, and it's always useful, isn't it, looking at that timeline back in sort of 2015 when we first started looking at this building. Yes, we were certainly not seen as part of the city cluster in that respect. And I think, you know, also we sit within bank conservation area as well. So Miguel talked about that part of the retained facade that's in the existing building. So we really had the constraint of, you know, sitting 1 foot in the conservation area as well. And really, we had to respect Finsbury Circus as well, you know, so that sort of lifting of the biophilia up onto the building, the planners were very interested in that relationship. And I think certainly, you know, a typical skyscraper here wouldn't have been appropriate. But I think the volume that we achieved, and with those stepping backs that it ended up creating those fantastic terraces, really still, as Miguel pointed out, and I think I mentioned as well, it still knits into the city, because at that low pedestrian level, you're really reading a solid building, you're reading a stone building, and you're reading a building that fits in adjacent to Deutsche and the rest of the context.
There was a suggestion earlier that the contractors would have quite liked to knock the whole thing down and start again. But in discussions with the clients were very supportive of the retrofit approach, were they?
Yes, the Sun Investments are very much sort of pushing their own kind of green agenda, and I think it's very interesting to find out how much the world's moved on since then as well. But yes, we certainly discussed it over a couple of meetings. Should we drop it? And as Mark said, working around the building, we had to work very. Did a PCSA with Skanska, brought them on board early to really so they understood how to take this building down and put it back together again. But yes, it was a fleeting couple of moments where we discussed dropping it, and then we felt, look, it's not the right thing to do.
And so, looking at the building now, I mean, we're entering a period of probably massive change in terms of the way people use and look at their offices. What are the things you say, damn, I wish I'd been able to had time to do that, or we'd known about that before? What are the things you would sort of do differently next time around? I think that we've built in a sort of enough sort of flexibility for the building to adapt to those sort of uses. I mean, we had very large floor plates, so we were able to achieve good net to gross without having exceptionally tight washrooms. That's the sort of thing that normally you have sort of very tight washrooms. We've got washrooms that are generous. We've got touchless sensors, etc. The main building maintenance systems are all sort of open, so you can add flexible entrance, QR code entrances, touch-free entrances, and those sort of things. So I think it's future-proofed for that. I think the only thing that, and we sort of started to do it with that rear space. I think the City of London especially, but also London itself, we need to be very open. We don't want buildings to be enclosed. They're about part of the place. So I think opening up that ground floor space even further would be something that we'd look to do even further. But I think we've built enough flexibility into the space to sort of allow people to put their own mark on the building. Yes, because that relationship to the street, I mean, the other side of London Wall is they're going to change the road there. I don't know if they're going to change the roadway outside your building, because I mean, that's now 4 lanes, isn't it, of motorway basically in the middle of the city. And that relationship with the street and the pavement and so on is something which the city are looking at very hard at the moment. Have they discussed that with you at all, or was that a part of their thinking about the?
No, the original discussions that the actual reason that sort of colonnade had existed was actually for the widening of London Wall going back a few years ago for the car, which we're certainly not going to be doing. But we also still had a good generous pavement, so they were supportive of us bringing the retail forward. Obviously, it increases the sort of retail aspect as well. So yeah, there hasn't been discussions about that, but certainly we've got wide pavements that can allow for future cycle routes, etc. And that was kind of discussed. I mean, only Copthall Avenue itself is quite a small road, but yes, we haven't discussed anything further of that at the time.
Thanks. Now we've got a question here. It is often commercial impediments that prevent structural consultants taking on the risks of warrantying existing structures. Presumably, you had to submit a regime of intrusive surveys and testing to satisfy your insurers upfront to take on this unusual risk. So that's one for Mark, is it?
Yeah, that's correct. We had to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, Peter, we did a huge amount of going around to survey splice connections. We loaded floor slabs with water tanks to take them beyond their loads, checking every connection. I mentioned steel sampling earlier, and going through. I mean, ultimately in the ground, a lot of the piles, it's always generally it's very difficult to sort of go back and provide a warrant, but we did do. We tested 3% of the existing piles to prove the sort of capacities, and you've got various factors so that we could bring those down as well. But I think it was a we do a lot of work anyway to sweat the structure, but in this case, to the extent where we were fully going to look at the as-built and survey it and understand it and get comfortable with that. So I think the message is that it's obviously possible. It just takes on some more requirements on the team to be able to do it and to really check it. But the result, just back to your previous one, Liverpool Street across, is that, we reduced a lot of loads here and ultimately took a 7-story building and added 5 additional floors. So there was always going to be some bits of strengthening needed to do it, but we certainly sweated the structure as much as we could to really get it down.
It is not an area that I'm experienced in, but I thought everyone in the industry these days wanted to offload risk, so it's really interesting to find you taking on risk. How does that work, and how comfortable are your insurers with it, actually?
The question is from an anonymous person. Maybe that's our insurer asking the question. But, I mean, as Andrew said, it's a measured risk, and I think if we truly want to be sustainable as an industry, everyone needs to be braver, and that goes from developers down to consultants. And it's about taking to borrow a phrase from a terrible industry, taking back control, and not having endless franchises of design responsibility. We kind of want to take on board as much as we're comfortable with on taking on board, and we're best placed to verify and justify the existing structure. And you take a balanced approach about how well archived it was, who the original team who built it, the kind of testing that we need to do to get comfortable with the quality of original construction. And as Andrew said, there will always be hidden structure, but a steel frame is all exposed. It's all there to see. Reinforced concrete frames are more complicated because the reinforcement stuff that does all the work is hidden, and you can never be anywhere near 100% sure. Same thing with piles, but it's about a balanced approach to actually getting comfortable and making ultimately your client and whoever occupies or buys the building following on from that comfortable as well.
Yes, no, the anonymous attendee says that he's not your insurer, but he's a structural engineer. So clearly he's admiring your bravery. So good. So well, anyone else in the audience want to ask a question? Because if there aren't, I'll ask the panel if they've got any other points that we might have missed, and then we can draw things to a close. Anybody like to add anything to Miguel or Emma? Sorry, I haven't asked you a question, but have you got anything you'd like to add? Miguel, yeah.
Well, actually, just to wrap it up, and to thank you, Peter, and the NLA for the opportunity for us to showcase this really important project for us. So thank you very much. But unless there's other questions, I don't think we did too much of a good job in explaining everything. There's no questions.
Yeah. That's a very good point. Well, you did do a very good job in explaining it, and thank you for doing it. These are really sort of important sessions for us. I think that it's really helped in terms of, might say, sharing competency and sharing ideas about putting buildings together is really important, particularly at the present time. And as I say, hopefully in the not too distant future, we can do these things in person. It's great to have tours of buildings. I was actually judging the City of London Building of the Year award only last week, where we normally for that the assessors visit 5 buildings, but there were 10 on the short list, and all the assessors wanted to visit all 10 because they've been so starved of looking around buildings for the last 18 months that and it was really everyone was very excited to actually get into all these buildings. So I hope that you'll enter this building for the City of London Building of the Year award next year, but we're about to announce the winners for this year shortly. So anyway, thank you all very much indeed. Thank you to our audience, although you could have asked more questions, but anyway, thank you all very much indeed for an excellent and fascinating presentation. Thank you very much.